Prison wasn't where I thought I'd end up, but then again, no one really plans for it. My name's Jason Cruz, 32 years old, and I never thought I'd go from running a small landscaping business to sitting in a 6 by 8 foot cell. But life has a way of turning on a dime, and one bad decision, pool cue across some drunk idiot's jaw, got me 2 years behind bars for aggravated assault. Inside, survival was simple in theory. Keep your head down, avoid the gangs, and don't owe anyone. I managed for the first year by sticking to that plan. But even the best plans go sideways, and mine did the day I agreed to run errands for Devlin. Devlin wasn't the biggest guy in the block, but he didn't have to be. He was wiry, sharp-eyed, and controlled most of the contraband trade. Cigarettes, snacks, even a little weed, it all flowed through him. His influence stretched across the yard, and everyone knew not to cross him. "You're quiet, Cruz," he told me one day while we were playing cards in the rec room. I like that. Quiet means you think before you speak. That's rare in here. It was the closest thing to a compliment I'd gotten since I arrived. It also meant he saw me as useful. It was why I agreed to work for him. At first it was small tasks, passing notes, delivering packages, harmless enough, but the deeper I got, the harder it was to get out. Then came the day Devlin's gold chain went missing. The chain was Devlin's pride and joy, a thick, flashy piece he always wore around his neck. He claimed it was an heirloom, passed down from his father, though I doubted any father would give their son something that screamed, "Steal me." But to Devlin, it was more than jewelry. It was a symbol of his untouchable status. It disappeared during yard time. By the time we were called back in, word had spread like wildfire. Someone had taken Devlin's chain right off his bunk. I was cleaning trays in the kitchen when Reno, one of Devlin's enforcers, found me. Reno was built like a tank, and the look in his eyes told me this wasn't a social call. "Devlin wants you," he said. I wiped my hands and followed him to the rec room, where Devlin was pacing like a caged tiger. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped scowl. "Cruz," he said when I walked in, "we've got a problem." He didn't wait for me to respond. "Someone took my chain, right off my bunk. I need you to find out who." "Me? Why me?" "Because you're neutral," he said, stopping to glare at me. "You don't have beef with anyone, and no one's got beef with you. People talk to guys like you. People also stab guys like me if they think I'm snooping," I said. Devlin leaned in, his voice low. "You'll be fine. Just find the chain." I didn't like it, but saying no to Devlin wasn't an option. So I nodded and got to work. I started with the old-timers, guys like Pete, who'd been inside so long they knew everyone's secrets. Pete was sitting on a bench in the yard when I approached him. "Devlin's chain, huh?" Pete said, chuckling. "That's a bold move. Whoever took it either has a death wish or a hell of a plan. Any idea who it might be?" Pete shrugged. "Could be anyone. Devlin's made plenty of enemies, but if I were you, I'd talk to Torres in the laundry. He sees a lot." Torres was a wiry kid with a nervous twitch, always glancing over his shoulder like he expected trouble. When I found him, he was folding sheets in the corner of the laundry room. "Collier," he said when I asked if he'd seen anything. "New guy. Been hanging around Block D. Word is he's got nothing to lose." Collier was easy to spot, a skinny man with a crooked nose and an attitude that screamed trouble. I found him in the yard, sitting alone at a picnic table, shuffling a deck of cards. "Collier," I said, sitting across from him. He didn't look up. "What do you want?" "Devlin's chain. Word is you've got it." A slow smile spread across his face. "Word travels fast." "Give it back," I said. "Save yourself the trouble." Collier finally looked up, his smile fading. "You think I'm scared of Devlin?" "You should be." He leaned in, lowering his voice. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't about the chain. It's about proving he's not untouchable. You think Devlin runs this place, but he doesn't. Not really." "You're playing a dangerous game," I said. "So are you," he shot back. Collier leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "But since you're so curious, why don't you come by my cell tonight? We can talk more then." I didn't want to go, but I didn't have a choice. That night, after lights out, I made my way to Collier's cell. The door wasn't locked, too many guards on Devlin's payroll for anyone to care. Collier was sitting on his bunk, the chain draped across his lap. "Nice of you to join me," he said, his tone mocking. "I'm not here to play games." "Yep," I said. "Just give me the chain and we can both move on." Collier smirked, picking up the chain and letting it dangle between his fingers. You think this is about the chain? This is about power. Devlin's been taking from everyone in this block for months. I'm just taking something back. I stepped closer, keeping my voice calm. And what happens when he comes for you? Because he will. Collier's smirk widened. Let him try. I've been in worse places than this. He stood suddenly, closing the distance between us. Before I could react, his hand shot out and grabbed the back of my neck. His grip was like a vice, and he leaned in, his face inches from mine. You think I'm scared of him? He hissed. You think I'm scared of you? It'd take me 2 seconds to snap your neck. You'd be dead before you hit the floor. I didn't move, barely breathed. His grip tightened for a moment, then loosened as he let me go. Take it, he said, tossing the chain onto the bunk. Give it back to your boss, but tell him this. He doesn't own me. He doesn't own anyone. I grabbed the chain and left without another word, my heart pounding harder with every step. When I handed the chain to Devlin the next morning, he didn't say much. He slipped it around his neck and gave me a satisfied nod. You did good, he said. I'll make sure you're taken care of. But I didn't feel good. Collier's words stuck with me, and every time I saw that chain glinting around Devlin's neck, I wondered how long it would be before someone else decided to take it, and how many bodies would pile up before the game was over. My name's Victor Morales. I'm 32 years old, serving 10 years for aggravated assault. Stupid bar fight. A guy got handsy with my sister, and I lost my temper. One punch too many, and here I am. That was 5 years ago. I've spent the last half-decade keeping my head down and sticking to the unwritten rules. Stay out of gangs, don't snitch, and mind your own business. It's worked so far, until now. The yard was unusually quiet that morning. Normally it buzzed with idle chatter, the rhythmic thud of basketballs, and the occasional spat of laughter. But today, it was tense. Heads were down, conversations muted. It felt like everyone was waiting for something. I didn't need to ask what it was. Big Ray was dead. Ray had run this place for years. He wasn't just the head of Los Reyes, the largest crew here. He was a stabilizer. Under him, there were rules, deals, and a kind of order. Sure, it was brutal, but predictable. With him gone, predictability was out the window. The rumors had started spreading even before the official announcement. Ray had been stabbed in the showers. They said his second-in-command, Hector, was taking over, but not everyone agreed with that. There were whispers of splinter groups, alliances forming in the shadows, and debts being called in. I didn't belong to any of it, but in a place like this, you don't need to be part of the game to get dragged into it. I kept to the far edge of the yard, pretending to stretch. I didn't like the way the guards were watching us today. Too casual, too ready. They knew something was coming. I scanned the yard, taking in the usual clusters of inmates. Hector was holding court by the weight benches, flanked by his crew. He was all bravado, laughing loudly and slapping backs, but his eyes gave him away. They darted constantly, scanning for threats. That's when I noticed him. A new face, sitting alone at the edge of the yard, just within earshot of Hector's group. He was young, early 20s maybe, and built like a boxer. His knuckles were scarred, his nose slightly crooked, but what struck me was how calm he looked, like he didn't have a care in the world. "Who's that?" I muttered to Ramirez, the only guy I trusted in here. Ramirez didn't even look up from his book. "Ricky Mendoza. Just got transferred in last week. Word is he's connected." "Connected how?" Ramirez shrugged. "Cartels, maybe. Heard he took out a whole crew by himself in county. Bad news, man. Don't get curious." I nodded, but I couldn't stop watching Ricky. He wasn't just calm, he was calculating. He sat there, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on Hector like a predator sizing up prey. The first punch came just after lunch. Two of Hector's guys jumped a member of the rival Norteño's crew in the cafeteria. It was brutal, trays clattering, fists pounding flesh, guards yelling. They dragged the Norteño away in cuffs, but not before he spat blood in Hector's direction. By the time we were back in the yard, the atmosphere had shifted. Tensions were high, and the guards had their hands on their batons, ready for the next explosion. Hector, emboldened by the fight, was louder than ever, barking orders and making a show of his authority. And then Ricky stood up. He didn't say anything at first. He just walked, slow and steady, straight toward Hector's group. Conversation stopped. Even the guards paused. "Something you need, new guy?" Hector's voice was sharp, his bravado slipping. Ricky smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "Yeah, actually, I need you to shut up." The yard went deathly quiet. Hector's crew tensed, their hands twitching toward their makeshift shivs. "You got a lot of nerve, kid," Hector growled. "You even know who you're talking to?" Ricky took another step closer. "I know exactly who you are. You're the guy who stabbed Ray in the back because you knew you couldn't take him in a fair fight. You're the guy who's so scared of losing control that you're making a mess of this place. And I'm the guy who's going to fix it." Hector laughed, but it was forced. Big talk for someone without backup. Ricky tilted his head, still smiling. "Who says I don't have backup? It happened so fast I almost missed it." One of Hector's own guys lunged, but not at Ricky, at Hector. The shiv went straight into his side, and Hector crumpled, gasping. Ricky didn't even flinch. "Clean this up," Ricky said, turning away. His voice was calm, authoritative, like he'd done this 100 times. The yard erupted into chaos. Guards swarmed, inmates scattered, and I just stood there watching as Ricky walked away like nothing had happened. That night, the tension in the block was suffocating. Hector was in the infirmary, and Ricky had taken over his crew without so much as lifting a finger. The guards didn't seem to care. As long as the violence stayed under control, they let the hierarchy sort itself out. I tried to stay out of it, but I could feel the shift. Ricky wasn't like Ray. He didn't care about deals or keeping the peace. He ruled through fear, and it worked. By the end of the week, he had the yard in a stranglehold. But fear breeds desperation. It started with small things: whispers, stolen glances, subtle shifts in loyalty. By the second week, there was open talk of rebellion. It wasn't just one group either. Everyone wanted Ricky gone. The final straw came when Ramirez didn't show up for breakfast one morning. I found out later that Ricky's crew had caught him talking to one of the guards. They dragged him into the showers and left him there. That was the moment I realized no one was safe. Not even the guys who thought they could stay neutral. I made my decision that night. I wasn't going to wait around for Ricky to notice me. If I wanted to survive, I had to act. I won't lie and say I wasn't terrified. I didn't have a plan, just an idea and a faint hope that I could pull it off. But in a place like this, hope is all you've got. The next day, I approached one of the norteños. He looked at me like I was insane, but he listened. They all did. It wasn't hard to convince them. We all wanted the same thing. The fight happened 2 days later, right after lights out. It wasn't a riot, not at first. Just a few accidents in the yard, a few well-placed words to stir the pot. But when the guards finally stormed in, batons swinging, Ricky was lying on the ground, blood pooling around him. I don't know who landed the fatal blow. Maybe it was one of the norteños, maybe it was one of his own. All I know is that by morning, the yard was quiet again. Before we dive into the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us. Thanks for watching. Prison life is about adapting. You learn the rhythms, the rules, the subtle nods that keep you alive. I'd been in for 2 years of a 6-year sentence for assault, and I'd managed to keep my head down. No gangs, no debts, no enemies. That was my mantra, stay invisible. But invisibility wasn't an option anymore when they moved in my new cellmate. It was just after lunch when the guards brought him in. He was massive, built like a linebacker, with a shaved head and a scar that ran from his temple to his chin. He didn't look at me as he stepped into the cell, but the air seemed heavier when he did. "Name's Tucker," he grunted as he dropped his bag onto the bottom bunk. I nodded, unsure what to say. "Eli." He didn't respond, just started unpacking his things. A toothbrush, a Bible, a few photos. Every action was slow and methodical, like he was measuring the weight of the world with each move. I'd heard of guys like him, lifers, hardened by years inside. The kind of man who had nothing to lose. The first night was quiet but tense. Tucker didn't talk much. He spent hours reading his Bible under the flickering light of the bulb, muttering verses to himself. I kept my focus on my book, trying not to let his low, steady voice unnerve me. The first real sign of trouble came on the third day. I'd just come back from the yard, and Tucker was sitting on my bunk, holding one of my books. "This yours?" he asked, his voice low. Yeah, I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. I like to read. He stared at me for a moment, then tossed the book onto the bed. Good. Means you keep quiet. I don't like loud people. I nodded again, swallowing my irritation. It was my bunk, my space, but I wasn't about to pick a fight over it. That night, I woke to the sound of Tucker pacing the cell. His footsteps were heavy, deliberate. When I opened my eyes, he was standing near the door, staring at the wall. "You okay?" I asked cautiously. He turned, his face unreadable. "You ever think about how easy it is to kill a man in here?" My mouth went dry. "Can't say I have." He smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "I have. Seen it too many times. People think they're safe behind these walls, but they're not. Not really." I didn't know what to say, so I stayed quiet. Eventually, he went back to bed, but I didn't sleep much after that. Over the next week, Tucker's behavior grew more erratic. He'd have loud arguments with himself, his voice echoing in the small cell. Sometimes he'd laugh for no reason, a low, guttural sound that grated on my nerves. One afternoon, I came back from work detail to find Tucker sitting cross-legged on the floor, carving something into the cement with a piece of metal. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Marking," he said without looking up. "Marking what?" "Time. Space. Doesn't matter." The scratches formed an intricate pattern, like a maze. It didn't make any sense, but the intensity in his eyes as he worked made it clear he wasn't to be interrupted. That night, I decided to talk to Alvarez about it. He was in the cell next to mine, and he'd been inside long enough to know how to handle these situations. "You need to be careful," Alvarez said after I explained. "Tucker's dangerous. He's been in and out of psych wards. Killed his last cellmate, or so they say." I felt a cold sweat break out on my back. "Killed him? Why the hell did they put him with me?" Alvarez shrugged. "Overcrowding. You're quiet, don't cause trouble. They probably thought you'd keep him calm." Calm wasn't the word I'd use to describe Tucker. Things escalated the next day. I was sitting on my bunk reading when Tucker slammed the door shut behind him. His face was flushed and his hands were shaking. "They're after me," he hissed. "Who?" I asked cautiously. "The guards, the other inmates, everyone." "I'm not after you, Tucker." "Don't lie to me." He lunged, grabbing me by the shirt and slamming me against the wall. His strength was overwhelming, and I couldn't break free. "You think I don't know? You think I'm stupid?" His breath was hot on my face, and his eyes were wild. "I don't think that," I said, keeping my tone calm. "I just stay out of everyone's business, Tucker. That's all." For a moment, I thought he was going to hit me. Then he let go, stepping back and shaking his head. "You're lying," he muttered, more to himself than to me. I spent that night sitting upright on my bunk, afraid to close my eyes. The final straw came a few days later. Tucker had been unusually quiet all day, and I'd hoped he'd calm down. But that night, I woke to find him standing over me, holding a shiv. "You ever think about how fragile life is?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. "Tucker, put that down," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He tilted his head, considering me. "You're scared," he said. "That's good. Fear keeps you alive." I nodded, trying to keep him talking. "Yeah, it does. That's why you don't need to do this." For a long moment, he just stood there, the shiv glinting in the dim light. Then, slowly, he lowered it. The next morning, I went straight to the guards. I knew what it meant. Being labeled a snitch in here is a death sentence, but I didn't have a choice. Tucker was transferred to isolation that afternoon. As they led him away, he turned to look at me. "Smart move," he said, smiling. "But it won't save you forever." I don't know if he meant it as a threat or a warning, but I still hear his voice in my head at night. In a place like this, safety is an illusion.